My name is Jen Waldhauser, and welcome to the Practice Makes Profit podcast series. The purpose of this series is to provide you with the professional resources you need to make your work, life, and business succeed. If you want to learn a little more about what we do, just click pause and go back to listen to our podcast teaser. Are you ready? Great, let's get started. One of the tasks that we hear a lot of design professionals say they struggle with is contract review. While this may not be the most exciting part of your job, I'm certain that it's one of the most important. In this 15-minute podcast, we will dive deep into the contract review process and learn a little more about what you need to know when you receive these documents. Specifically, what to look for in the contract, any pitfalls and risks associated, and why spending time reviewing them the right way can save you money. To help us better understand the contract review process, we've brought in an expert on the topic and one of our My Professional Net pros, Marie Bernier. Marie has over 25 years of professional liability, underwriting, and risk management experience. If her name sounds familiar, you may have listened to one of her over 50 webinars she's delivered to firms just like yourselves. She's currently a consultant and coach to small businesses and individuals and a member of our My Professional Net team. Without further ado, welcome Marie.
Jen, thank you for that great introduction. And I'm really excited to be a part of My Professional Net team and to be part of your podcast series.
Well, Marie, you are definitely a welcome addition to our team, and we're very happy to have you. So let's just get right into it. Marie, why is the contract review process such a big deal for design professionals?
It's a good question, Jen. The client relationship really starts when that client accepts your bid and you move forward with now contract negotiations. That's when the relationship really begins. We want to shake hands, get started, and have the best experience for both you and your client, right? Mm-hmm. So why has the contract become such a kind of an icky thing when people are starting the negotiations? The contract governs the relationship. It also sets the stage of how the relationship will go. And it's the perfect time for the design professional to make that relationship solid and make their client understand, I shouldn't say make, but have their client understand how they're going to operate on the project. The thing is, though, it's not the most fun part of the project, right? So oftentimes we procrastinate when we don't like to do fun things. And I think that's probably why I see so many projects get started without a signed agreement, because it's almost like drudgery. And it doesn't have to be, because it's really good business sense to achieve the best possible outcome on the project, to just know what your relationship is going to be from the beginning. As I always say, happy clients mean repeat business or even referrals, and that would be great. So what are some other things that you want me to highlight?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right about that whole contract process. But let's start at the very beginning. So can you walk us through some of the basics of the actual contract and, maybe give us a few key areas that are the most important to look for?
Sure. One of the things you may hear me refer to a few times throughout this podcast is the standard AIA B101. It's the 2017 version. And the reason I do that, I know it's an architect's contract, but it is a model contract out there that any design professional can kind of gauge against some of the language. And it's used a lot, especially since the architects generally are running certain projects if you're doing residential design, for instance. So we talked about setting the stage. In the AIA B101, the initial information happens to be section 1. And the reason for that is it solidifies all of the important information about how the project is going to go, as well as sets expectations on both sides, both the client and the design professional. So things like the project, what and where, what are the milestone dates, When's the design phase going to end? When is this, site supervision? What is the anticipated completion date? Those kind of things. One of the most important things that is highlighted in this section of your contract is the project representative. Who are you going to contact on the owner's side for questions, clarification, et cetera? Because it really should be one person so that there's no, missed cues. As well as who is the design professional's contact where the owner can always go to and ask questions and review documents with. Also, this is the area where the owner will tell you if they are engaging any other consultants on the project. Common sometimes when you're breaking ground would be a geotechnical engineer. And whether or not you are hiring subconsultants on the project. And if you are, it's really good to know who those people are and to put that out there for the owner to see. I say that because the owner may or may not have worked with those particular subconsultants in the past, and this is where you would learn if their experience was good or maybe not so good. That's not something you'd want to find out in the middle of the project, right? Mm-hmm. So moving on, standard agreements are great. We'd all love to have a standard agreement with nothing crossed out, but that's probably not going to happen often. So if you're using a non-standard agreement or one of the standard agreements that's modified or there's language crossed out, I always advise clients to pay particular attention to that non-standard language.
Yeah, I honestly would think that anything crossed out would certainly trigger a pause and, give a little bit of a question.
Yeah, exactly. You want to be sure that the intent of the clause is still there. It's not that it's wrong to cross language out. It may not be relevant to this particular project, but it's always important to be sure that you don't lose the intent of what that clause was supposed to do in the contract. So I'm glad you recognize that, Jen. Thanks. Mm-hmm. Next, the meat of the contract is going to be the scope of services. It really is the biggest part of the contract. It's really important to define not only what you're going to do, but also what you're not going to do. That sounds a little strange, but oftentimes, lots of things are subject to interpretation, and services can be subject to interpretation, especially with an owner that is not familiar with kind of how these projects go. So I always say it's very important to identify what you're going to do as part of your basic services, any additional services, so the owner recognizes that's not a normal service that's provided in the basic services, as well as what you're not going to be doing. That will go a long way to setting expectations and understanding how your fee works. The other thing is payment terms. Just be sure you understand how and when you'll get paid, as well as how that fits into the cash flow of your business. Oftentimes, that's probably one of the least reviewed clauses because sometimes it is what it is, but just be sure you understand that. And last, insurance requirements. This is where I tell design professionals, if they're not familiar with their insurance program, to go talk to their broker or the carrier that they use, the insurance company, and make sure that they have the required insurance that the contract is asking for. Not having that information actually could lead to a breach of contract, and it's such an easy thing to review and get in place if you need additional limits or something so that you are complying with the contract. Now, there are probably some other areas, Jen, I'm thinking that you might want me to cover for the design professionals that are on this podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a great review of all the basics. But I would imagine that there are some areas in particular that are of bigger concern. The areas that, a business owner would kind of find themselves thinking, that, this might be my area that I have to pay attention or might find themselves at most risk for. Is there something you can help us with that?
Sure. Design professionals love to design. They like to create things. And that's wonderful. I wish I was creative like that. But they're also business owners. And so there are things that they want to look at in a contract that may put them at a higher risk than they want to be at or be liable for. So a few of them I'll go over here. Indemnification clauses are the big ones. Just as a note of reference, the AIA B101 does not have an indemnification clause in there, which I think some people find surprising. But there isn't an indemnification agreement in there because the standard of care is spelled out in that agreement as to what the design professional should be liable for, that a reasonable design professional in the same area with the same type of services, how they would be performing. Now, I'm not an attorney, but the standard of care is what a design professional is responsible for. However, everyone likes indemnification clauses, so you're going to find them in most contracts. So what you want to pay particular attention, because you can take on business risks there that are beyond business risks that are contemplated in your fee. That's how I'll put it. Sometimes you do have to take on business risks, but sometimes they're beyond what your fee is reflected on. The other thing is oftentimes you see in an indemnification terms like every, best, all, highest standard. Now, every design professional wants to think that they are giving their best project, their best design, but best means perfect, and no one's perfect, not even design professionals. And so it's important, go through that indemnification clause and cross out those kind of terms, and then see where that phrase or that clause sits after you've crossed those things out. Indemnification is something we could cover in an entire, podcast or webinar. So I just gave you a few tips here to give you some things to think about.
Great.
The other thing I think becomes a business risk is not getting paid. It's actually one of the most important elements of the professional-client relationship, but it's often overlooked. Jen, you might be surprised to know that over 70% of design professionals don't like to ask for money.
Wow, that's interesting. Actually, Marie, in our December My Professional Net newsletter, we actually shared an article about strategies on how to get paid on time because, like you said, it's kind of an awkward thing to do sometimes.
That's great. Actually, I'm really glad you mentioned that to the audience out there, because how timely that we're talking about payment, and you're giving them some tips on how to get paid and not sound, like a bad person doing it, right?
Right.
Good. Well, the last thing under not getting paid that I don't think in general people think about is if you haven't defined your services well, or you haven't defined additional services well, or what you're not going to do as part of your services, you can find yourself rendering services to a client that isn't part of your fee, and the client's not going to pay for it likely because they think it was part of what your services were. So I kind of call that not getting paid either. So just keep that in mind. Getting paid is important because it's how your cash flow and how your business is going to run. So be sure that you stay on top of that during the course of the project. And last, one of the things that puts you at most risk is not having that signed written agreement when the project starts. It is very common, surprisingly, but it's something that happens because you want to get the project started, you want to get going. But think about it. If you start a project and that nothing is in place signed, or it's still in negotiations, you lose a little bit of leverage because, hey, you already started the project, right? So just keep that in mind, and maybe some advice I can give you when you're negotiating the contract so that you can get through those touch points where the negotiation may be a little stronger and on the wants on either side, is know what you're willing to accept, what you're willing to negotiate, what you're not willing to accept, and when you should walk away. I'm not suggesting walking away from a client, but there have been times when there's a lot of back and forth that maybe you don't feel comfortable with. And so listen to your gut about that.
That's fantastic. Marie, thank you so much for taking the time to educate our audience about contract review process. I know you've given our listeners so much valuable information, and that I'm sure the next time they, have a contract come across their desk, they're going to look at it with a new set of eyes and a new perspective. Before we end today, can you share the top 5 things design professionals should remember
Sure. Jen, we covered a lot of information. And so I want to make sure that they walk away with that punch of let me just make sure I do these basic things. So I would call that set the stage, outline that initial information, set your expectations up front for both the expectation of you as well as your expectation of the client. That can be done by defining services. Review the indemnification or hold harmless clause. Pay attention to payment terms and be sure it fits in with how you run your business. And lastly, review the insurance requirements and ask for help if you don't understand if you're meeting that requirement.
Those are 5 great points. I think all design professionals should put those on a Post-it note and put it right next to their desk so, they can review them often as soon as the contracts come around. So Marie, what do you suggest if any of our listeners have any additional questions that, we haven't addressed today?
Oh, well, thank you, Jen. I'm glad to be here. And I actually really like that Post-it note idea. I'm sorry I didn't think of it myself. Anyway, if anybody that's listening to this podcast has additional questions or wants some clarification, I say first and foremost, reach out to your broker. That's what they're there for. They're there to help you understand your risk, help you manage your risk, and help you find the right resource. And so they'll know whether you need to go outside to an attorney, go back to the insurance company, have a contract reviewed, those types of things. And of course, I also provide contract review services. So you can reach me by email at B as in boy, ERNIERM for Marie, 080@gmail.com.
All right. Hopefully everyone wrote that down. Thank you so much again, Marie, for your time and your incredibly helpful advice about contract reviews. I am certain that everyone has learned something today and will be taking on those extra points going forward. Thanks again. Thank you for listening to Practice Makes Profit podcast series. Today's guest was Marie Bernier, who provided us with helpful tips and tools when reviewing customer contracts. We hope you enjoyed the discussion. Please click the subscribe button on your favorite podcast provider to listen to more Practice Makes Profit topics. My Professional Net is a member source network of specialty business service providers just for design professionals. Each episode of the Practice Makes Profit podcast will highlight different experts that can help your firm excel in business. Is there a particular consultant that's helped your business? Maybe an accountant, an HR consultant, or a website designer? Someone that you think has a story to tell your peers? How about yourself? Do you want to be a guest? If so, please email me at jen@practicemakesprofit.pro. Again, that's Jen with 2 N's at practicemakesprofit.pro. And as always, please click the subscribe button. It helps us get this show promoted and shared with all design professionals. Well, that's it for now. We hope you enjoyed this discussion, and please join us for our next podcast.